Welcome to the quest, everyone. Before I get into tonight's stories, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps support our channel. Now, let's get started. About 2 years ago, I was driving home from a family reunion pretty late at night. The drive was about 2 hours. I didn't stay the night because I had to be back at work the following day. Most of the drive was on roads with dense bushes and trees on either side. You know, the real creepy ones you see a lot in movies. Anyway, I had been driving about 45 minutes and I was starting to get really tired. And do you know how sometimes you suddenly become really tired out of nowhere? Well, yeah, that happened to me. I knew I wasn't going to last, but I didn't come across any place that I felt like I could park and safely sleep. And anyway, after it became clear to me that I wasn't going to find a place to pull up, and my tiredness wasn't going away, I did something pretty questionable. I pulled over to the side of the road onto the grass behind some bushes, and I tried to hide my car from anybody who was going to come past. The roads weren't entirely empty, and I came across another car every few minutes or so. I made a mental note that the time was 11:22, and then I fell asleep. Sometime later, I was awoken by a scratching sound. I looked at the clock, and the time was 11:50. The sound stopped after a few seconds, and because I was still extremely tired, I didn't bother looking around and simply went back to sleep. I was later awoken by the same sound, and it was now 12:40. This time it really freaked me out because the sound didn't stop. The thought ran across my mind that it was just an animal inspecting my car, but why would it return almost an hour after it had left the previous time? I looked in my rearview mirror and just managed to catch a glimpse of something running into the forest. Now, at that time, I thought it was the damn hook killer. You know, that one that scratched that couple's car and then slaughtered the guy when he got out to investigate? Screw that, I thought to myself. So I got the hell out of there. There was a bend no more than 100 yards up the road, and as I came around it, there was a car parked off to the side of the road with the driver's side door open. I slowed down just to look and see if anyone was in there, and there wasn't. Then I looked in my rearview mirror, and I didn't see anything. And then all of a sudden, this guy comes sprinting around the corner, and he starts screaming at me, shouting stuff like, hey you, get out of your car now." I got out of there and sped off. I never saw the guy again. Moral of the story, don't sleep on the side of a deserted road. When I was in high school, I had a really good friend who lived next door to a house that was always up for sale. People would move in and out in the middle of the night without a word, and it hadn't had the same owner for more than 6 months straight for a couple of years. One night, we were really bored, and he suggested we go explore the house next door, since it had sat empty for a while. We go around the back, and there's a dog door that he can crawl through. He unlocks the door and lets me in. The house itself is really unremarkable. It looked like it was built in maybe the 1950s. It was a craftsman-style house in an older, nicer part of town. My friend's house was similar. The kitchen had a really nice built-in breakfast table set against a picture window. The house's electricity was off, but you could still see through the street lights coming through the windows. My friend and I sit down on the floor across from the table. We're just hanging out talking. All of a sudden, my friend screams, and in an instant my vision goes black. It wasn't that I just couldn't see. My body was engulfed in this sickly coldness from head to toe. I start screaming, and I feel my friend's hand grabbing mine and pulling me in a direction forcefully. My vision comes back slowly, and I start to warm up when I realize that we're outside underneath a streetlight. This time it was December, and it should have been much warmer inside that house. Finally, I look at my friend, and he looks scared, and I'm really confused and kind of panicked myself, and I finally ask him what happened. He says that as I was talking, this black thing, this figure that was all black and had the vague shape of a girl, crawled out from underneath the table and sat on top of me. Apparently, I started groping around with my eyes wide open, like I couldn't see, and he was so freaked out, he pulled me out of the house. We're still friends, and he brings it up every now and then, but the story itself never changes, and it still sends chills down my spine. To this day, I've never felt such blackness or coldness in my life. It was palpable, almost sticky. For a couple days afterward, I couldn't shake this unsettling feeling, and I could never walk past that house again. This story takes place when I was a kid, about 7 years old. I had awesome parents who let me sleep in the living room on weekend nights when I was very young, because my sister was a light sleeper and I could stay up until dawn. But of course, I always ended up sleeping on the couch because Nick at night just made me tired. So one night, I wake up to this prickly feeling, and I just bolted into a sitting position and stared out the front window. We lived in rural Georgia, so you can imagine the magnitude of the trees. In perfect light cast from the moon, I see a silhouette of someone in this freaking tree. The family dog dashes to the window and is snarling into the glass. Terrified, I run to my parents' room, and I try to explain to my parents that there's a strange person outside. Dad grabs something defensive and darts outside with the dogs to beat the wax off the hothead. I tremble in my mom's arms until my dad comes home. He says he saw no one and says to go back to bed. I decide to sleep in my regular bedroom, and I fill my sister in as to what happened. Dad is making regular rounds in the house with a cup of coffee, and we're all still, and I finally think I can sleep. Nope. I notice a man outside my window. From what I can see in the moonlight, he gives me a shush signal and runs away. He just turns around and ran in a straight line away. I swear I couldn't stop crying for what felt like hours. So my uncle used to work a lot when I was younger. He's done a lot of different things to make money, but one consistent thing is that in the summer months and into the late fall, he paints houses. It's a legitimate business and everything, and he's got a truck with a number and a name and supplies in the back. The works. Every now and then he would call my dad when he needed a little extra help, and I'd work for him. No big deal, really. It's just painting houses. Well, it takes a while to paint a whole house, and if the weather conditions aren't right, then you can't paint. One particular fall season was extremely wet, and it rained for what felt like every single day. My uncle would paint multiple houses at a time, so sometimes he would get caught up due to situations like these, and I would work a little more than usual. That was fine by me, though. The job wasn't hard and it paid pretty well. Anyway, it was a pretty warm day for late fall, but there was still a distinct chill in the air, one that kind of penetrated through you and stung your soul. My uncle had this job that he had to finish. It was on an old Victorian house in a quiet part of town. A lady and her husband, who was an author, lived there. Due to the weather, it had taken longer than expected to paint the house, and there was family issues going on at the time, which further complicated things. So my uncle gets a call one day from the lady who lives at the house. She says that her husband is trying to write his next book, but he keeps getting distracted by the scaffolding outside the house. So she wanted to know if we could come over and finish the job as soon as possible. My uncle was always an honest businessman, and they had contacted him to do the job midsummer, but he had had a lot of jobs that summer, and the wet conditions that I mentioned before made it difficult to finish anything. However, these people were insistent, but really polite, not wanting to lose a customer or get a bad recommendation. My uncle decided to put the house as a high priority. After all, it would only take a day or two to finish. So we show up to this house mid-afternoon. Like I said, there's kind of this weird chill in the air, but I also remember this really eerie calm. The day was slightly overcast, so everything was shrouded in gray. It was like the perfect setting for a mystery crime novel. So we arrive at this house, and my uncle and I move into the back. The front of the house was already done, so there's nothing left there. My uncle, being the more experienced painter, would always do the touch-ups, and I'd simply apply the first coats since they took a little skill. Anyway, we get to the back of the house, and he asks me if I'm scared of heights. I was 17 at the time. Although they do creep me out a little, I didn't want to seem like a child in front of my uncle, so I told him I wasn't. He was happy to hear that, and he has me climb the scaffold to the third floor to finish an upper section of the house. There was a window up there, a small little oval one that looked into the attic. The attic also happened to be the husband's study. He would do most of his writing in there. So as I'm climbing the scaffolding, cans of paint dangling behind me, and various paintbrushes and other tools in the utility belt that my uncle let me borrow, I get to the top of the scaffolding and set all my supplies down. I crack open a can of paint and I start painting, like I had a few hundred times before. Outside of the temperature and the overcast and the eerie calm, this day was like any other. I'm working my way across the top part of the house when I get to the window that looks into the study. I bend down to dip my paintbrush and stand back up to paint above the window. The window was in my direct line of sight, and I couldn't help but gazing in. I see a man, the husband, staring back at me, with a face completely barren of any emotion. I had never seen a face so devoid of feeling before, and I still haven't. Of course, I get startled, and I take a step back. I chuckle and I smile at the guy, but he doesn't smile back. Instead, while remaining completely emotionless, he draws a pistol up to his head that he was holding in his hand the whole time, and proceeds to blow his brains out, without ever breaking eye contact right in front of me, all while I'm staring at him. In utter shock, I gasp and I let out the smallest scream as I step back in fear. Only, I stepped back a step too much, and I fell off the scaffolding. Alerted by the gunshot, my uncle looked up, in just enough time to see me fall off the scaffolding from the third story. I was lucky enough to land in a bush and only suffer a broken ankle and a few scratches. The biggest wounds happened in my head. I had to go to counseling for a while, and it's been years since then, but I still remember that man's face. I've never forgotten it. It'll always be burned in the back of my head. And I know why, looking back, his face was so devoid of emotion. Because he had never felt any emotion at all. He literally didn't care about what he was doing. And as it turns out, the man was seriously depressed and facing marital issues with his wife. Combined with a few too many nights drunk on whiskey and facing writer's block, I guess he decided he couldn't take it anymore. His wife moved out of the house shortly after, and we never finished the job. To this day, that house remains abandoned. And to this day, I try to not drive down the street it's on. I'm scared that if I do, and I happen to pass the backyard, I'll see that man staring back at me from that window, cold and emotionless. When I was about 13 or 14, I lived on a farm in North Carolina. This wasn't a regular farm that you'd expect with fields full of beans and stuff. It was actually a pine harvestry. Pine needles are a big landscaping commodity, and we lived in basically the woods, and we would bale the pines dry every year. Whatever. The point is that my house was in the middle of 550 acres of perfectly lined longleaf pines. My living room had a huge picture window. I won't go into the architecture of the house, but it was a weird custom job built by some dentist in the 1930s. The window in the living room stretched nearly the entire length of the room, maybe 50 feet. The house was built on a subtle hill, so the living room itself sat 5 or 6 feet off the ground. So you had something of an angle to look out a solid mile of pine trees. During the winter, it was unsettling because you'd just get a bit of snow, enough to reflect the moonlight, so you could see dogs running around at night. I'll be honest, I hated that room and that window. So now to the relevant part. I had a cousin over for the weekend, and we were doing what kids do in the country. Throwing stuff in the fireplace to see what happens. Well, it's getting late and the fire's dying down. So we build the big kingdom of couch cushions and blankets in the living room, and we get ready for bed. Nothing out of the ordinary until we hear dogs barking. They were really far away. The property stretches for nearly a mile, so I assumed they were just chasing off whatever animal felt like crapping in my yard. So my cousin is staring out the window and not saying anything, which prompts the standard, "What's up?" He just kind of keeps staring, and he says he feels like he's seeing things. Naturally, I get all anxious, and I start staring out the window as well. Nothing happens for a few minutes, and he gets more and more annoyed with me because I'm asking what he saw. He keeps shushing me so that he can focus. And then we both see it. A shadow of a person moves from one tree to the next. Not a run, not a leap, just a brisk walk from one tree to another. This is probably 100 yards from the house. We can't actually tell if the person is coming closer or not because we're dealing with moonlight reflecting off the snow. I guess the crazy part is that we didn't freak out so much because at this point, there's still a chance that we didn't see what we saw, So we just keep staring. We should have gone and woken up my dad, but he's an idiot and the kind of guy to walk on the patio and holler into the woods with his rifle. And we were just scared enough to agree that we don't want to taunt whatever is happening. So about 3 minutes later, it happens again, but a good 50 feet from where we first saw it. Another person, another tree, a few strides, and they were gone. This happened every few minutes for the next half hour, and we just stared. At this point, I should mention that I didn't really have neighbors. The land surrounding ours farm was federal paper. I don't know who owns it now. So it was miles and miles of uncultivated trees. You don't see people around the farm unless they intend to be there. So we kept watching as these two figures intermittently appear and vanish until we finally see one appear but not disappear. Instead, we focus in and see it. It's now running forward, and we lost our crap. We go and wake up my dad, and by the time we get into the room with my half-awake dad, there's no one to be seen. We sprint around, locking doors and windows, and keep in mind, we're out in the country with no one around, so we rarely lock doors. Every door was worse than the last, because you just know that as soon as you reach for the door, someone's going to be trying to open it, although that never happened. We locked everything up and walked around the house at least 50 times, making sure that no one got in without us knowing, then convinced my dad to fall asleep in the living room with us while we stared out the window. I never understood why my dad wouldn't call the police. He always had this "we take care of our own" mentality, and it simply wasn't an option to call 911. The next day, we went to look out, and absolutely, there were footprints everywhere in the snow. We saw them between the trees, and we finally saw where someone had been standing, right in front of the window. But as I said, I wouldn't have seen them, because while I'm 7 feet up in the living room, they would have been standing right beneath me.